What I'm going to talk about today is really what's been happening at a global level and how carbon markets are created, particularly because we're at a situation in Australia at the moment where things are moving very quickly. We're on the edge of having a significant carbon market emerge in Australia, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about what some of the drivers of that market are. Over the last 16 years, we've had a significant international negotiation around climate change law and policy. And I think it's important to put this in perspective. This is not something that's new, but it's something that's been going on for a very long time. So since 1992 all the way to now, the international community has been negotiating an entire legal framework which is the basis of the carbon markets. And there are 2 points to make right at the outset, which will be elaborated on by the next two speakers. The first is that to have a carbon market is really a creature of governments imposing laws that create that market. Secondly, changes in the laws and changes in the policy have a significant effect, and sometimes an immediate effect on the market, the size of the market, the price of carbon, and other factors like that. So as we in Australia sit at a point where things are changing very quickly, the extent to which businesses respond is very much a reaction to that change in policy. As sort of Robert alluded to, the key international instrument is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and under that the Kyoto Protocol, which we ratified last year. And as I said, it really is 16 years of negotiation, but it has only really just begun. And some of the things that we know at the moment in the US, there's a lot of debate about where the carbon market's going, but the very fact that McCain has become the leader in the Republican race, and the fact that you have two proponents on the Democrat side who are both strong advocates of a national cap and trade scheme in the US means that we know there's going to be a large US market as well. And for those who don't know, McCain has already proposed previously a cap and trade scheme, federal emissions trading scheme for the US, and there's already legislation within the US Parliament. So when we look around the world, we've got the EU, we've got the US, all these sort of markets are coming together. It's only about, I think, 10 to 12 weeks since the Rudd government was elected, but we've already got the more defined policy for mandatory reporting by companies in place. We have, yesterday there was released legislation, although by the Democrats actually, but to push the 20% target in renewables by 2020, so that should be 20%. We know there's emissions trading coming, which will be there by 2010, which Anthony will talk a little bit more about. The federal government has said it's going to enact fairly quickly legislation under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, whereby any significant new project which has an impact on Commonwealth issues will need to undergo an impact assessment for climate change impacts. And earlier this week, the government also reintroduced legislation whereby if you plant carbon sinks in Australia as a business, you get a tax deduction. So within the space of these last 10 to 12 weeks, there's a significant momentum in Australia about new legislation. And what happened in Europe was that a lot of the European companies didn't really get across what was going on until the emissions trading scheme was in and until the obligations took effect. In Australia, we have the benefit of knowing that these schemes already exist and we know what's coming. So I think businesses are really preparing itself now. So we're sort of standing on the edge of what is really going to be a fundamental growth period in these legal frameworks that create these carbon markets, and that will sort of spur a lot of deals being done and a lot of transactions in the carbon space. With respect to, just a quick comment on some of these legal frameworks. A lot has been said about the Kyoto Protocol, and what the Kyoto Protocol does is it sets legal caps on countries to reduce their emissions, and those caps are then put down to a domestic level by governments. So Australia's response is we will work towards our target by putting in place a cap and trade scheme, which is what the EU has done. In Bali last December, when Australia did go and ratify Kyoto, we had a standing ovation. In effect, it brought Australia in from the cold. We had been on the edge of the United Nations negotiations on climate change, and by ratifying Kyoto, we've sort of come into that tent. But what it's also done is put expectation that Australia will actually deliver and will play a significant role in the international negotiations, particularly given that we haven't done so before. And you saw in Bali that Kevin Rudd played an important role in sort of negotiating between the parties in China and bringing China into sort of supporting various amendments. And what came out of the Bali discussion was really a roadmap that within the next 2 years, we have to have binding international targets for the period beyond 2012 in order to reduce emissions. So after a lot of hard negotiation at Bali and almost a complete failure, they did come out with the Bali roadmap, and it has set down a clear path. And many people think this is a success because the alternative would have been that we didn't achieve anything and countries would have objected. But the real challenge now is how we get into that process, developing countries. About 12 days ago, 2 weeks ago today, in fact, the European Union also laid down an ultimatum. In effect, what it said was that there's two paths going forward. The EU have already developed the emissions trading scheme. They're trading fairly aggressively within that scheme. It is the core of the global carbon market. And what the EU have said is that there's an ultimatum now. We, the EU, are prepared to put in place 30% targets. We are prepared to reduce our emissions 30% by 2020 only on the basis that the international community comes along with us. So if other people take on targets and we get momentum, then we will take on very aggressive targets in Europe. We will increase the size of our market. We will continue to allow other countries to generate offsets that come into our market. However, what they've also said is if you don't play ball with us and you don't come along, we'll only take a 20% target. We won't allow a lot of offshore credits to come in. We won't allow China and India to continue to create offsets and put those into our market. And we're going to put trade sanctions at the border so that if you have a product that is in effect created offshore and you want to import it into the EU and it's not exposed to a carbon impost within the jurisdiction that it's developed, you'll get in effect a tax which is similar to what EU companies would pay. So they're really up in the ante here. So we've sort of gone from 16 years of very slow negotiation to suddenly this year, and I'd say the next 2 to 3 years, a significant momentum. We know that New Zealand's having their cap and trade scheme is being developed, Australia, and we're also seeing the continued growth of the large voluntary markets. So when Robert talked about people like News Corp and others, which I'll come back to in a moment, wanting to offset their emissions, they have to go into the market to buy carbon. And a lot of that carbon comes from people doing offset projects. And while there was a view that voluntary market would sort of die with the growth of compliance markets, the reality is that the voluntary market has also grown significantly globally and will probably continue to do so.